everyone. Today we will be discussing the anatomy, physiology, and function of the brain and its different components. This will be a more generalized description as the brain contains a myriad of different roles and more detailed purposes throughout the course of its different facets and makeup. So we will begin with our anatomical terminology. The largest structure, containing 83% of the brain's mass, is of course the cerebrum. The cerebrum is most commonly recognized by the gray enveloping surface of the brain. Within the cerebrum is the wrinkled structure called the cerebral cortex. The components of this unique shape have specific functions, and the cerebral hemispheres, consisting of the right and left anatomical sides, are symmetrical in structure, as you can see appearing here, but contralateral or opposite in function through their different neural connections as they communicate with one another. They are divided by the longitudinal fissure, a pronounced groove creating a mid-sagittal divide. These functions include motor areas, the sensory areas, and integration areas, or otherwise known as interpretive regions. In order to fully understand the different areas of the cerebral cortex, let us begin with the white versus gray matter and then continue forth into the different components and their functions. The superficial gray matter in the cerebral cortex consists of 40% of the brain mass and deals with the functions of the brain such as sensation, memory, communication, and voluntary movements. Let's look into the different parts of this structure, starting with the individual ridges or the mounds of this wrinkled gray matter that are called the gyrus or the plural gyri, the home of the regions in charge of important elements such as motor and sensory components for communication with the nervous system. The importance of gray matter in the cerebral cortex deals with its function in terms of physiological makeup. So the gray matter contains nucleus or neuron cell bodies of the nervous system, the central nervous system, dealing with higher level of communication, so more of the complexities between interneurons as well as in communication through the spinal cord into other parts of the body through long axons. The grooves between the wrinkles are called the sulcus or sulci for plural and help contribute to the division of different lobes of the cerebral cortex and locational framework. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. And then the parietal occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe as it dictates within its name. We can see examples of these systems at work in regions such as the precentral gyrus in front of the central sulcus as part of the frontal lobe. This makes up the primary somatic motor cortex. This is the way that individuals can pick something up off the ground, where the action potential begins with the thought of this occurrence, such as picking up a pen or a piece of paper, and the action occurs within this area. The pyramidal cells that will fire action potentials down through their axon hillocks will occur throughout the cord, and then synapse on a neuron within the anterior horn as part of the motor cortex, the motor neurons that exist within that anterior column. This only occurs alongside of other cortices, which means that the area does not evolve in knowledge with time, but rather knows how the action will occur on a more mundane and basal level, and the other neurons with help from the complex levels will assist in carrying out the function with its recognition. The postcentral gyrus houses the primary somatosensory cortex, such as we see here in the larger portions with the face and the hand, that have a sensitive abundance of neurons which become stimulated through this cortex. This is in charge of the first sensory reception in the cortex, so the very initial reaction that you have to a stimulus, such as somebody touching your shoulder. It's only the initial reaction to stimulus or spatial discrimination. This is not involved in a reflex per se, This is more having to do with a learned function of behavior that then coincides with this spatial discrimination, and we learn to attend to as an adult. So therefore, it doesn't include the interpretation of where the touch came from or what the touch is in a more specific, localized manner. Let us continue deep from the superior central sulcus to the corpus callosum, as we see here. This is a large medial commissure that serves as the communicating connection between the two hemispheres and consists of a bundle of axons, or the white matter, as I had discussed previously. Well, when we observe a mid-sagittal line through the corpus callosum, as we see here, we can begin exploration of a significant region medial to the cerebral cortex, which is the diencephalon. This contains the major center for all communication that goes from the cerebrum to the rest of the nervous system, both through input and output signals. The only exception being the olfactory tract that's utilized through our sense of smell. The diencephalon makes up the large structure that is superior, the thalamus, which relays all sensory information aside from olfactory sense of smell, as I had kind of mentioned. So we're talking about touch and visual and auditory, all those different kinds of things. So it begins from a pseudopolar neuron, which arrives to the synapse in the medulla through afferent sensory information. So those axons are bypassing the neuron in the spinal cord, in the dorsal column or the dorsal horn. And then the second synapse is occurring in the thalamus following the decussation at the medulla, so the crossing over of those neural pathways. And the thalamus then, as that action potential reaches the synapse in the thalamus, helps you to focus your attention on important information. The hypothalamus is the second large structure that is seen within the diencephalon. It has a large connection of nuclei that help detect lots of things, such as when you're hungry, aroused, or emotional, and it's a gateway to many other abilities and functions along these kinds of lines. It's an incredibly important structure. As we discuss neural cell bodies and their function in our central nervous system, let us continue to go further deep into the subcortical structures, such as the basal nuclei. We're going to explore the basal nuclei, which consists of the caudate, the putamen, which are the striatum, because when you remove the axons from this area, it has striations or stripes, and the globus pallidus. So these are neural cell bodies, as I said, consisting of gray matter at the base of the brain, hence basal. The basal nuclei influences the concept of attention, particularly when in need of immediate detection, such as when someone slams on their brakes. It helps you to narrow down that focus through those sensory outputs and action potentials. This also inhibits unnecessary and antagonistic movement, and unfortunately the best example for impairment can be seen through impairment by individuals with Parkinson's disease who have consistent involuntary hand tremors and head twitches. As we continue further inferior and posteriorly, we can see the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. This area consists of both gray and white matter with many different kinds of purposes. The midbrain coordinates perceptual spaces through sensory representations with the visual, auditory, and somatosensory areas of the cortex, as previously mentioned before when I was discussing their different kinds of functions in the gyrus, along with the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe that deals with auditory sensory information. The pons and medulla sections control systems involved in the autonomic system for survival instincts, such as cardiovascular and respiratory functions, for example, the heart rate. The superior and inferior colliculus in the posterior part of the midbrain have reflexes from the optic nerve to connect from your eye muscles and the muscles even in your neck, involved in different kinds of survival instincts, to move quickly towards whatever the stimulus is. However, is not the primary survival instinct, as we have found in later studies. This is all connected to the rest of the basal nuclei through the substantia nigra, which, as we have discussed, when failure to be regulated is the cause of Parkinson's disease. Finally, we reach the cerebellum, or the little brain, which is utilized for regulation of subconscious activity involved in the movement and patterns of sensory information through the spinal cord to the involuntary skeletal muscles by efferent information. Essentially can be demonstrated geographically, as I like to think of as balancing between the brain and the brainstem, since it deals with postural awareness, so you're able to keep upright. And it's able to have control over the timing of your movement and adjust to any circumstances as they occur, such as when multitasking, when you're walking and eating and watching your phone, so you don't trip and fall. This concludes the general exploration of different parts of the brain, their function and significance, as well as physiological structural makeup. Thank you for your time.